There's a fascinating new survey out from the nonprofit organization PRRI, and they wanted to figure out how nostalgic the American people are. So listen to these results. This is really interesting. They say 51% say that American culture and way of life have worsened since the 1950s, while 48% say they have changed for the better. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton supporters are on opposite ends of the spectrum. 72% of likely Trump voters think things have changed for the worse, while about 70% of Clinton voters think things have changed for the better. Okay, now that's really, really interesting. And I would be curious to see what it was like in, say, 2006 or 2007, when you had a Republican president in office for a while. And perhaps then Democrats would have said the opposite and Republicans would have said the opposite because they're just that partisan. But I don't know. But if we were to analyze this just from the facts that we have here, there are some somewhat contradictory takeaways. So if the Republicans are saying, hey, put social issues aside, let's only talk about economic issues, I'd love to bring back the 1950s. If they were to say that, that honestly is not a crazy thing to say, and in fact, it's dead accurate. So in other words, there was a time in U.S. history where it was called the Golden Age of economic expansion. And we had the middle class that was the envy of the world. We had stronger unions, stronger social safety net programs. We had a middle class that was the envy of the world. We had factory jobs out the wazoo. You still had Europe reeling over World War II, and we were the only country who were exporting all of our goods and making money hand over fist, and we were a super duper duper prosperous nation. On top of that, when you looked at our tax system, it just made more sense. We had a much more progressive tax system, and the top marginal rate, for example, hovered around 90%. And we're talking under a Republican, Eisenhower. So now some people go, oh my God, that's crazy, that's insane, I can't believe that. No, but that's like every modern nation, they have a high tax rate on the affluent, a marginal rate to be clear. And remember, marginal is different from a regular rate. Now, the effective rate was lower than that. It wasn't actually 90% or 93%, I think was where it topped out. The effective rate was more like, 45% or so. But that's still more than we have now. Now it's 39%, and that's before you add in the loopholes and the deductions. So we did have... It's true, we were more economically liberal, so we had a more prosperous middle class. And Republicans are saying, hey man, we like that time. Now, I don't think they know that aspect of it well. Because, if you look at a lot of Republicans, they're holding, lower taxes, man. And a lot of Republicans for a very long time, definitely the establishment Republicans, were all about outsourcing deals and saying no to protectionism and tariffs. But during the 1950s, during that time frame, we actually were much more protectionist. And, it was a better system economically. So if they're talking about that stuff, they're actually right. The Republicans are right in that, yeah, economically that was a better time. But, here's the big but, if they're talking about social issues, not only are they wrong, they're hideously wrong, monstrously wrong, and they're bordering on savagery. Because they say, oh yeah, the 1950s was better, let me tell you. Really? Well, how was it for blacks? How was the 1950s for blacks? We still had segregation as the official rule. It was law in the South. Segregation! 1950s! Also women. How were women treated? Well, the whole idea was, and it was super duper pervasive throughout society, is your ass belongs in the kitchen. That's where you belong, and that's really the end of the conversation. How was life for gays in the 1950s? When you look at social issues, it's not even close. We were much more backwards, and we've progressed big time since then when it comes to social issues. Now, again, the exact opposite here applies to the Democrats. When the Democrats say, well, things have mostly gotten better. Look, if they're talking about, for example, the technological revolution and the internet and all that stuff, totally true. If they're talking about what life is like for minorities, totally true. So much better for women, so much better for blacks, so much better for gays. The list goes on and on. But if they're talking, just broadly speaking, economically, no, the middle class has been stagnant since the 1980s. And we have extreme income inequality, and we have more money in politics today. We had much better rules back in the 1950s on money in politics. Today, it's a free-for-all. I mean, we live in an oligarchy. There was a Princeton study that said that. They say, yeah, the U.S. is no longer a democracy. So economically, we're way worse off. So look, there's a little bit that's correct on both sides here when they talk about this. And furthermore, I've seen other studies that say the Democrats also do feel high levels of nostalgia, just not for 1950s, for understandable reasons when it comes to social issues. They say more like the 1990s, which, by the way, also could explain one of the many reasons why Hillary Clinton is likely going to be our next president, is that the American people can't, and the Democratic loyalists certainly can't get into the weeds when it comes to the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, and say, oh, look, you passed NAFTA. That really, really hurt us. You did the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which repealed Glass-Steagall and led to the giant crash in 2007 and 2008. So they can't get into the weeds. They just have this feeling like, oh, well, the 1990s was better. And, by the way, a lot of that, again, probably had to do with the fact that Clinton was riding that tech bubble, the internet bubble. So the economy was thriving at the time, but it wasn't necessarily because of his policies, because many of his policies were right-wing, and, they eventually came back to bite us in the ass. So both parties feel nostalgia. It's just for different times, and there's a grain of truth in both of them there. But the thing about the Republicans that irks me is that I fear they don't know why they want the 1950s back. They can't articulate the economic stuff I just laid out for you. So it really does have more to do with, wasn't it better when the minorities knew their place and the women's knew their place?